Good afternoon. My name is Melinda Smith, and I'm the Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary and a professor of political science. It is my honor to welcome you to Courageous Conversations. Courageous Conversations is a speaker series that is designed to engage in difficult, uncomfortable, challenging, but necessary dialogue about the big and difficult issues of our time, including about racism, colonialism, and social inequities. These courageous conversations are necessary in order for us to think seriously about transforming inequities in our universities and the broader society. They are necessary if we are to ameliorate these inequities and also to unsettle and transform colonialism. Courageous Conversation is one of the number of events that are taking place within the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the University of Calgary. And it is my hope that it will be one that people come to for these honest and, I think, honest and brave conversations. Today's theme is coloniality and racial injustice in the university. And we have four renowned speakers: Dr. Sonera Tobani, Dr. Delia Douglas, Dr. Annie Ross, and Dr. Inakshi Dua. Dr. Dua will be joining us a bit later on in the program, but she will certainly before the question period. So before I go any further, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that regardless of where you are joining us from, I am confident we are all residing on Indigenous land. I am here at the University of Calgary, Alberta in Canada, which is home to the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And this region includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Sutnia First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, diaspora, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. This series is entitled Courageous Conversations, and it's named after two key figures. One is Maya Angelou, who has argued that courage is the most important of all virtues, because without courage, we can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage. So my view is, in order to be intentional and deliberate and systemic, and to engage in systemic inequities, to address them, we actually need courage. Otherwise, we waver from this commitment. The second person who inspires this Courageous Conversation speaker series is Violet King. Violet King was a Calgarian and Canada's first Black woman lawyer. And King, when asked why she wanted to, as a Black woman, wanted to go into law, to become a lawyer, a criminal lawyer, she said, people told me it wasn't a good idea for a girl to be a lawyer, particularly a colored girl. So she persisted and she went ahead and she achieved what she hoped for. My view is the speakers in the Courageous Speaker Series are like Maya Angelou and Violet King. They are courageous and they persist despite the challenges and obstacles they confront. With that, let me talk a little bit about the panel discussion today, which examines how the politics of race and settler colonialism are presently negotiated by and within Canadian universities. These 4 talks draw on the most up-to-date theoretical and empirical scholarship, as well as their own experiences and encounters with the institutions of higher learning. They demonstrate how the issues of Indigenous dispossession, racial violence, corporatization, and militarization shape the epistemological traditions, classrooms interactions, as well as the administrative practices of the institutions. So without further ado then, let me introduce the first of our 4 speakers. Dr. Sanera Tobani is a professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. Her scholarship focuses on critical race, post-colonial and feminist theory, globalization, media, citizenship and migration, and violence, Muslim women, and the war on terror. The title of Dr. Tobani's presentation is Present Past, the Anxieties of Power. So, Dr. Tobani.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am on Coast Salish territories here in Vancouver. I would like to thank Dr. Melinda Smith for organizing this session. It's an honor to be here. And I would also like to thank my co-presenters. It is an honor to be with all of you on this panel. So this panel is based on a book, Coloniality and Racial Injustice in the University, soon to be published by the University of Toronto Press. The book features the research presented by the panelists here, as well as other scholars, at a conference organized in conjunction with the UBC Faculty Association in 2017. Our book examines how Eurocentric epistemologies and cultures of whiteness function within the current university. We show how the institution's treatment of scholars and students of Indigenous ancestry and of color, its treatment of our histories, experiences, and perspectives, along with its punitive approach to anti-racism praxis, makes the university a key site for the production of colonial racial hierarchies within the institution as well as beyond it. Our studies of the university took place at a moment when the global war on terror, with its multiple forms of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant and anti-refugee racism, etc., was deepening discourses of Western culture superiority, particularly their feminist and queer articulations. This was also a moment when white supremacist movements unleashed by the war were erupting with some force across much of the West, including on university campuses. By studying the linkages between these momentous developments and the university, we identify how the older forms of settler colonialism and production of race are reiterated in their newer neoliberal and imperialist forms. On my own contribution to the book, I would like to make just 3 main points here. The first is that the university is an institution in crisis. In many ways, this is to state the obvious. For now, we are in a moment when multiple crises are unfolding simultaneously. But what is at the heart of these concurrent crises and of the crisis of the university itself? In the Canadian context, critical scholarship has tied the crisis of the university to neoliberalization, to the toll taken on the institution by deregulation and privatization, funding cuts, tuition hikes, pressures to compete in a global field. These are all identified as having deepened the institution's ties to the corporate sector, such that the latter's values and practices now reign supreme in higher education. Much of this critique, however, does not address race or coloniality in any substantive manner at all. My chapter in this book identifies race as being at the center of the university's crisis. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has now blown open the usual papering over of the racialized nature of inequalities that shape Canadian society. Likewise, mainstream political culture has been transformed by the white supremacist politics that target Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. The devastation wreaked by the economic downturns and environmental catastrophes are taking their greatest toll on these communities. At the heart of this multiple crisis, then, is the issue of race. The Canadian University, however, is dominated by willfully race-blind approaches, which leave it unable to address these multifaceted crises other than to contribute to their intensification. For even when the institution recognizes race and colonialism as problems, as it does in the present moment, this is largely tokenistic and a passing phenomenon. Such recognition has not led to any significant rethinking of how the institution itself is enmeshed in the production of racial power structures. Indeed, such tokenizing approaches are used to counter attempts to transform the institution. This brings me to my second point. The university has historically yielded nothing to people of color without struggle. The lessons of the past teach us that it is only when these struggles gain unstoppable political momentum that the university has conceded anything to our communities. The presence of people of color and Indigenous peoples that we see in the university today was the achievement of the radical movements of the 1960s and on, mainly led by student activists. The global context of these movements, of course, was the national liberation movements that were transforming the post-World War II international order. It is these movement politics that compel the university to respond to the demands of Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. I will point to two recent examples to illustrate this point. In 2017, the findings of a SSHRC-funded study of how Indigenous scholars and scholars of color were faring at Canadian universities was published, The Equity Myth. Of course, Dr. Melinda Smith and Inakshi Dua were involved in this research project. The findings found that despite over 3 decades of mandated equity measures and policies, BIPOC scholars were underrepresented and particularly severely so in the humanities and social sciences. Black, Indigenous, people of color scholars were found to experience racism in various forms. Our work is poorly recognized. We are paid less than white faculty and face more hurdles in tenure and promotion. We also have more stressful workloads and working conditions. The study concluded that the university is, quote, a bastion of whiteness, and that equity remains a myth. That the documentation of such a scandalous situation across the Canadian academic world would spark no urgent or concerted effort from administrations, the professoriate as a whole, or even the associations that represent us, spoke volumes to just how tolerable these conditions are to these bodies. Compare that to the university's very quick response to the Black Lives-led uprisings of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color against racist violence and injustice in the summer of 2019. University departments immediately produced solidarity statements, administrations rushed to pledge to do better, and many universities began creating new faculty positions for Black scholars. Certainly, the increased representation of Black and Indigenous scholars in the academy is to be welcomed. This is long, long overdue, and it is absolutely vital. But this inclusion is not linked to the larger transformation of the institution's structure of racial power. Recognition and inclusion are on offer, not the dismantling of the structures of racial injustice. Indeed, this very recognition and inclusion are intended to restabilize the institution to help it override the current crisis. And this leads me to my last point. Even when the university has yielded space, etc., to people of color, it has done so only to use our individual advancement to counter the transformative possibilities of our movement politics. For the institution penalizes those of us whose work remains grounded in our communities, in the struggles and the transformative visions of our communities. The institution's organization of the conditions of inclusion of Black, Indigenous, and people of color scholars thus obfuscates the nature, content, and forms of the very struggles that have made it open its doors to us. By predicating our advancement through an individual careerism that is used to redefine and counter the ongoing collective struggles of people of color and Indigenous peoples, the university ensures the reproduction of the hierarchies of race and the coloniality of power. With anti-racist and anti-colonial movements galvanized to a momentous level once again, our book points to the dangers of capitulation and accommodation and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tobani. Next, we have Dr. Annie Ross joining us. Dr. Ross is an Indigenous teacher and artist working within community inside the Canadian West. Dr. Ross is a professor in the Department of First Nation Studies at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. The title of Dr. Ross's presentation is Don't Cry, Fight versus Deference to the Corporate State, Abrogation of Indigenous Rights and Title, and Civil, Social, and Environmental Justice at the Imperial University. Dr. Ross.
I'm always doing something silly, sorry. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the honor of being here. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for organizing the Courageous Speaker Series, and Dr. Tobani for the introduction. And I thank everyone in the audience as well for joining us today. I think when we talk about these types of things, I first like to express my gratitude that we're able to have words of these hard realities so we can share our knowledge of history, of current times, and more importantly, what the practice of our work and its meaning is and are. And in this way, we can move closer to the actualization of the potential of our rights and viabilities, our thrivance, and in many cases, just talking about the ability to live in our lands, and not only for humans, but for all living beings to survive and thrive. So that means we have some hard realities to look at together, and thank you for being together for this. I think I'll start with the ending that I've learned in my time in the academy. And it's a question whether one may or may not, can or cannot simultaneously actively work for the actualization of our human civil rights, our environmental justice, the rights of Mother Earth, the rights of water, the rights of rivers, and all of her beings, Indigenous rights and title, while simultaneously the university actively aligns itself, trains students in rapacious cultures of violence, which destroy these very rights and title, and the collective abdication of our collective responsibility to place. In other words, how does a professor build up through the university and through the classroom knowledge of abrogation of rights while the university publicly unravels the work? I'm thinking of neoliberalism in the university, which I define as a system that grants corporations impunity to abrogate rights and to commit what may be considered crimes, especially against Indigenous peoples. Imperialist neoliberal economics, the violent taking, the rush to the last of every living being, is entrenched systemically, psychologically, and culturally, is infiltrated every social institution, such as politics, corporate culture, popular culture, and of course, the university, which is the training ground for the accountants and the engineers and the city planners, the politicians, etc. That work of systems directly comes from the university. I'm thinking about corporate realities that are backed up and enforced by military and paramilitary security forces, the violence of the factory farm, the violence of the spreadsheets, and we can think of the link to World War II, which was called genocide by typewriter. And those things and places and institutions that are so tied as their foundation to development. And they do all manners of things to have their way, including indoctrinating or attempting to indoctrinate all others into their manners, ideologies, and practices. An imperialist university as an advancer of neoliberalism is one in the chain of those who abrogate Indigenous rights and title, social and environmental justice, civil rights, the rights of all living beings, not only to survive, but thrive. Quoting MacDonald and Ruckert, neoliberalism represents a new form of social rule under which elite class power and the profitability of capital have been successfully restored. I'm thinking of ruin equal to the effects of war when we see the tar sands with the unremediable landscape, any of the processes of the nuclear industry, the factory farm, and how can we make, more importantly, beauty and justice, beautiful justice real? How do we actualize our established, enshrined, and inherent rights? How do we meet the responsibilities to land and her beings? And one way we can do so is to first learn and understand the names, the personalities, the wants, the desires of every Indigenous living being in our region upon which we share our lives, to understand and practice those Indigenous laws, processes, protocols, all of those responsibilities that are lifelong to our particular, with our particular homeland place, to ensure all beings have the right and the ability to thrive. This change is mandatory, absolutely mandatory, to transform the heart of the neoliberal monster from one of violence and wreckage to one of responsible peace and justice making with and for our sacred planet and all of her beings. We can no longer, universities may no longer align themselves with globalists accused with compelling evidence of horrendous racialized, sexualized, and violent crimes in advance of their business corporate models. The de facto practice in massive resource extraction, the roots of racism, misogyny, and speciesisms in business and political practices, with violent rights abuses from military and other state-sponsored actors. The ruinous model is making life untenable for most of the planet and has to go through a major transformation. And I believe the Indigenous logic of specific place would help to turn that around and make that transformation real. Some of the things we need to address, not as a side note through the university and align ourselves with, are not the Canadian mining companies, but addressing as a priority life-giving clean water, and to put our intelligence and our dreams and our imaginings into maintaining and ensuring clean, life-giving water. We need to do something to stop the importation of the culture of sexualized violence via man camps, other such extraction industries, gangs, importations of drugs, alcohol, weapons. We need to find a way to transform our industrial footprint from one of poisoning via nuclear, chemical, radiological, and biological weapons of war. We need to see and find a way forward that does not use as its modus operandi the imposed poverty and other human rights abuses that we see when large resource or relative extraction happens in specifically indigenous homelands, including the importation of food insecurity, the purposeful destruction of the commons, extinctions, the creation of red lists. Many of us who only know specific species because they are on a red list and we see them on the internet. There is so much unmet need in our country, in our hemisphere, for the basic human needs, such as adequate housing, clean water, education, fair access to a broken judicial system. I believe it's through the looking at traditional indigenous systems, which did and do meet the basic necessities of life and the ability to thrive culturally, socially, spiritually, and physically, which are point of collaboration for the future. I believe this is meaningful, purposeful, important work. It's worthy of all of us. It's worthy of our planet for our own survival and thrivance. There is no shortage of need for this work and for many of us workers to carry it out, regardless of the unraveling going on. Sometimes I feel through the sacrifice of the classroom or all the different things that we are each individually and collectively doing, it's like building a house and putting nails into the house, and then the university or the corporation or the corporately influenced university takes out all those nails during the day, and you're left with a pile of boards at night. Finding a way to truly rebuild and treat and transform with Indigenous-centric bioregionalism on knowledge of place, a very close personal commitment, and a love for our beautiful land is one of the greatest works I think the university can involve itself in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Our third speaker is Dr. Delia Douglas. Dr. Douglas holds a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her scholarship is interdisciplinary and is attentive to the continuing significance of the legacies of enslavement, imperialism, and settler colonialism. Her research and teaching interests consider struggles for social justice with a focus on critical race and gender studies, Black diaspora studies, equity in higher education, and sports studies. She is the anti-racism practice lead for the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at University of Manitoba. Dr. Douglas's title is Access Denied, Safe/Guarding the University as White Property. Dr. Douglas.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to Dr. Smith for hosting this event and to Dr. Tabani for all the work that you've done to create this edited collection. And thank you to my co-presenters and to everyone in attendance today. I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I also acknowledge that Northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are original homes of the Inuit. In the context of dispossession, ongoing settler colonial violence, and the violence of anti-Blackness born of enslavement, I build on Cheryl L. Harris's groundbreaking work, Whiteness as Property. I consider how the university operates as white property in terms of its physical location, structure, culture, population, and pedagogy. I argue that these patterned exclusions and willful refusals to address the politics of race and racism demonstrate what happens when capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and the university collide. My talk is guided by the words of anti-apartheid activist Stephen Biko, who stated that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. I begin with the question, what's going on? Despite over 30 years of an employment equity policy and a cultivated self-image of successful multiculturalism, the proportion of some of the four equity-seeking groups, women, Indigenous people, racialized people, and persons with disabilities, within Canadian universities remains deplorably low. Equity is essentially meant gender equity, with the majority of hires being white, able-bodied women. As a result, these institutions remain overwhelmingly white in terms of administration, faculty, curriculum, and culture. Indigenous scholars remain the most underrepresented of the four identified equity groups, and there are substantive differences among the representation of racialized academics. For example, the increase in Black academic staff has been markedly slower than their representation in the general labor force. Of the approximately 64,000 university faculty, Black women comprise approximately 300 of the 1,000 faculty who are Black. Few have acknowledged how the pattern of privileging some equity groups over others has resulted in racialized and racist outcomes that maintain the current state of racial inequality. A question I've often asked myself is, how can you not know? Toni Morrison's presentation, Unspeakable Things Unspoken, provides an imaginative discussion of the erasure of a Black presence from American literature that is helpful to my understanding of how white racial domination exists alongside national narratives that simultaneously promote declarations of racial innocence and publicly celebrate diversity. She states, "We can agree, I think, that invisible things are not necessarily not there. Certain absences are so stressed, so ornate, so planned, they call attention to themselves, arrest us with intentionality and purpose." Following Morrison, I maintain that assertions regarding the irrelevance of race, combined with the renunciation of Canada's past and present racial violences, call attention to themselves, compelling us to question avowals of virtue and racial harmony. In short, the disappearing of the brutality of conquest and ongoing settler colonial projects, along with the championing of multiculturalism, work to engender a consciousness in which white, British, and French settler colonial subjects recognize themselves as the rightful inheritors of status, identity, and power in Canada. These structured denials thwart recognition, enabling white Canadians in their effort to not see or contemplate racism, or even the probability of racism. In her formative text, Whiteness as Property, Cheryl L. Harris outlines how, in her words, the origins of whiteness as property lie in the parallel systems of domination of Black and Native American peoples, out of which were created racially contingent forms of property and property rights, end quote. She locates the relationship between whiteness and property as tied to, and I quote, the right to exclude, end quote, those who are not racialized as white. The fact that colonizers created laws that forcibly removed Indigenous people from their land and differentiated between enslaved and free illustrates how whiteness represents a property interest that is not simply based on difference, but on white supremacy, since the processes wherein an individual is racialized as white were based on extermination, segregation, dispossession, and forcible manipulation. This system of ownership converts people, ideas, and land into property that can be possessed, purchased, and sold, since proprietorship enables one to do whatever one deems appropriate with one's property to ensure profit. Canadian universities uphold the university as white property through geographic domination, racially exclusive social networks, loyalties, and a coercive system of labor through what Dolores Calderon terms settler colonial narratives or grammars of erasure. Because knowledge production is a crucial apparatus through which the needs and interests of the settler colonial state are advanced, I maintain the university's regulation of racialized bodies is linked to its regulation of racialized bodies of knowledge. Hiring is key to the renewal of a department, a program, and its future. Owing to the fact that white women have largely benefited from gender equity, we have seen what Melinda Smith describes as the diversifying of whiteness. As the majority of new hires, they've also become the new gatekeepers, demonstrating a racial allegiance that has worked to consolidate white power. It is precisely because these racially structured environments are not named as such that the university's practice of racial segregation continues in plain sight, hidden behind the ostensibly objective criteria of excellence, competence, and best fit, semantic strategies that authorize the institutionalization of white racial hegemony. I am mindful that the link between embodiment and knowledge production is neither simple nor straightforward, but the lack of urgency over 3 decades demands that we consider the meaning and significance of the absence of certain bodies and the related absence of certain bodies of knowledge, since it is principally white scholars and administrators who make decisions about whether race matters, how it matters, and in turn, if it matters at all. The corporate neoliberal university has created an economic and moral environment which is at once an economy of value and an economy of violence, since one's worth in the system is determined by one's perceived and conceived abilities, potential, and anticipated contribution to the university and to society at large. For Black women, given the legacy of white supremacist discourses regarding our humanness, our marginalization and exclusion from the ivory tower holds a particular cultural and political significance, as this is readily taken as evidence of our presumed incompetence. As a result, both faculty and students are denied the opportunity to see the world through our perspectives, thereby preserving intellectual and spatial hierarchies. All told, Canadian universities secure what Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang describe as settler futurity, as students are socialized through the erasure of a broad range of experiences, voices, and areas of study. The predominance of white faculty also means that there are few opportunities to provide Indigenous, Black, and racialized students with role models, mentors, and advisors. When these students do not see themselves reflected and respected in the curriculum they study or the professors they encounter, these systemic exclusions have psychological, embodied, and material ramifications, as the cultural identities of white students are affirmed at the same time the cultural identities of Indigenous, Black, and racialized students are marginalized, distorted, or rendered invisible. The absence of a critical mass of Black, Indigenous, and racialized faculty also makes it difficult for the targets of repression to speak up for fear of reprisal. This atmosphere of hostility and terror is not new. It has been foundational to the reproduction of the settler colonial playbook for several centuries. In closing, we cannot eradicate racial inequality and injustice unless we recognize the interconnectedness of systems of domination and challenge the divisiveness of hierarchies of oppression. There is no time like the present to create more equitable institutions and to work to cultivate relationships that are founded on the principles of integrity, respect, racial equity, and social justice. Can I get a witness? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas. Before I introduce Dr. Inakshi Dua from New York University, what I'd like to do is encourage people who have questions to put them in the Q&A section. And we will return to them after our presentations. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Dua, who has just returned, left her class, and so I know it was quite a feat to join. Dr. Inakshi Dua is a professor and graduate director in sexuality and women's studies in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at York University. She teaches critical race theory, anti-racist feminist theory, post-colonial studies, and feminist theory. And as Dr. Tobani noted, Dr. Dua is a co-author with me and Francis Henry, Audrey Kobayashi, Carl James, and Howard Ramos of the Equity, Racialization, and Indigeneity at Canadian Universities. Dr. Dua's title is Our Canadian Culture Has Been Squeamish About Gathering Race-Based Statistics. The circulation of discourses of race and whiteness among Canadian universities, newspapers, and the alt-right groups. So without further ado, and thank you very much, Dr. Ina Dua.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Melinda. I apologize for missing all of the other papers. I know this is going to be recorded, so I'll have an opportunity to go back and hear them. But I certainly, I'm looking forward to the ongoing dialogue that this panel will lead to. It's a delight for me to be here. First, I'm with dear friends. But also I remember when Professor Thabani began this process, and it was such an important beginning. It brought together in a dialogue a number of us to really, really continue to think deeply about the ways in which racism, gender, indigeneity and gender, work in Canadian universities. And that workshop was the beginning of wonderful, conversations that certainly have influenced what I've been able to do for that collection. So, I want to honor where we started and the legacy of that kind of inclusionary dialogical space. So thank you. So my paper, my chapter for the book is a really long one. And I hate, just going to pull it up. I always hate using Eurocentric expressions, but here this one seemed to be the most apt. The details are really in the devil in this chapter. And as you'll see why the details are important, and I won't really have an opportunity because I've been told I have 7 minutes. Is that right, Melinda? Yeah, so I don't have an opportunity to go through the details, and I encourage you to really look at the chapter because really part of what is important here are those details. But what this chapter is for the last 20 years, the issue of collecting race-based data in Canadian universities and other sites has been really a contentious issue, leading to social and political debates. In the 1980s, Canada developed a legislative and policy framework for the collection of race-based data. And despite that framework, the federal government's commitment to the collection of race-based data has been both tenuous and eroded since inception of these policies. Complicating public debates of race-based data is the differential ways that it's deployed. On one hand, similar to other kinds of statistical data, the collection of race-based data is central to governmentality. So debates on the collection of race-based data include the ways of using race-based data for police boards to defend practices of racial profiling. On the other hand, the collection of race-based data has been tied to anti-racist struggles and strategies for to call for policies that address discrimination. The collection of race-based data has been tied to effectively monitoring discrimination, identifying and removing systemic barriers, and ameliorating historical disadvantages and promoting substantive equality. So, many in this forum have been part of these struggles in their university. What's interesting is that the project for collecting race-based data to identify systemic barriers has been met with institutional, political, and social resistance. And there's been very little research for the reasons of this resistance. So my chapter in Professor Thabani's collection has two purposes. First is to explore this resistance. And I want to start with an instance of where I first encountered this resistance. My first job was at a university that was predominant, where there were very few faculty of color, less than a handful. And when I got that first tenure stream job, I advocated for employment equity policies that would address the underrepresentation of racialized faculty. The response by my colleagues and senior administrators was to claim there was not, in fact, underrepresentation because there were not that many people of color and Indigenous folks with PhDs. Now, that was certainly a distortion of what was there because we all knew of amazing scholarship being done by Indigenous colleagues and BIPOC people who were not able to get access to university job. And so, I asked, at that point, I thought strategically that we examined the data on Indigenous and at that point we used the term visible minority in Canadian universities. And a Canadian administrator responded that such data does not exist. And I want to point out in many universities, the struggle for data is continuing. Now, because perhaps that it was mandated by government policies, there was an awkward silence. And the administrator quickly added, "It's a difficult issue. It's not in our culture." Now, the deployment of culture is one that we all know is one loaded with racial signifiers of inclusion, whiteness, and nation. And, that used in an interaction between a white administrator and a racialized woman was one that was very telling. Now, in carrying out research on the collection of race-based data for the equity myth, I came across two statements that got me thinking further about where this resistance to collecting the race-based data comes from, and that loaded word culture. So I came across a statement made on September 2nd, 2006, by the then vice principal of Queen's University in an interview about the collection of race-based data at Queen's. And he was quoted as saying, "Our Canadian culture has been squeamish about gathering race-based data." Now, it was notable and it resonated, because this is something I've heard and many have heard when in that period when it came to collecting race-based data, this tying of collection of race-based data in somehow Canadian culture. And it was intriguing. What I also came across was a statement about 18 months later, in February 2007, by the leader of a US-based neo-right white supremacist group called American Renaissance. And the leader's name is Jared Taylor, who, as I hope if I have time to go on, has a really infamous history. He was one of the ones who was the organizer for the Charlatan, the alt-right organizing in Charlatan, United States. And Jared Taylor gave a speech in Halifax. And in that speech, he focused on the problems of racial diversity. And in that speech, he turned his attention to the collection of race-based data. Now, his purpose here was to talk about the use of race-based data for governmentality. But Taylor drew on the metaphors of Canada and culture and on the speech by the vice president of Queen's University in claiming Canada is too squeamish to collect crime statistics by race. So notably, the statement, "Our Canadian culture has been squeamish about gathering race-based data," would be something that would connect two projects on race-based data. One that was within universities, and the second by an alt-right group. I became really intrigued by this. And I became intrigued as I was tracing the history of that phrase, that it was also deployed by politicians, by newspaper columnists, by other neo-right groups, such as Immigration and Watch Canada. So what I do in the paper, and as I say, the devil really is in the details, is I trace the kind of resistance to the collection of race-based data in Canadian universities, in Canadian newspapers, and in the alt-right. Very specifically, 3 sites of alt-right sites. And one of the things that I trace, and this is again in the details, is how the same arguments against race-based data were reflected in all 3 spaces. And secondly, how the same phrases moved from all 3. So let me start with the first, the same arguments for the resistance of race-based data. When I traced this in Canadian universities, based on interviews that I did for the equity myth, one of the, in exploring with equity officers and equity activists, why it was so hard to collect race-based data, particularly into the last 5 years, one of the things that often came up was culture. And interrogating what is meant by culture, what a number of equity officers pointed out, that culture was a word that was used to prevent, to talk about white privilege and the way the university was embedded in whiteness. And so the culture, it wasn't in the culture to collect race-based data, was one that re-articulated a project of whiteness. The other area of resistance was that what equity officers reported was the resistance to collect race-based data was really also located in that if we did have data to prove discrimination, then we would have to take some action. And so the resistance to collecting race-based data was also a form of resistance, institutional resistance to anti-racism. So I trace, through these interviews, the way in which this resistance to collection of race-based data, it takes place in Canadian universities, and how it's often located in that, that really deep and loaded term culture. Am I running out of time, Melinda? Okay, I'll try to sum up. I then go and trace this in Canadian newspapers. And what's interesting is when I trace this in Canadian newspapers, all of the newspapers were tied up with the 2 arguments I identified. The first was the importance of collecting race-based data for governmentality to show crime. When there were reports of activists' attempts to collect race-based data to show systemic discrimination, newspaper journalist after newspaper journalist, and here 2 mainly, Margaret Wente and Rosemary DeMano, wrote continuously on how the collection of this data was problematic and undermined it. And in undermining it, they again they defined it and used words that resonated. And I traced that resonation. But a lot of where the resistance was located was that anti-racist claims are a threat to Canadian society. They're a threat to our culture and need to be resisted. And the collection of race-based data, and then in many ways is dangerous to this nationalist project. The third site I looked at was alt-right sites. And what was interesting was the same arguments were being made there with the same phrases. And again, this is where the devil is really in the details. But what would be said by a columnist in the Global Mail and the Toronto Star would be echoed in alt-right sites with the same phrases that was being used in Canadian newspapers, used to make very similar arguments that anti-racism is dangerous to Canada. And the collection of race-based data is tied to that and therefore should be resisted. So I'm going to sum up here because I know I've run out of time. But what for me is really important in tracing the circulation of discourses in these three sites is that we often see alt-right groups as outside of universities. When there are incidences in universities, administrators often claim those are people from outside the university. This is not about us. You know, we see this in the United States right now, as well as Canada. We often see alt-right groups as a specific group that is isolated from the rest of our society. And what tracing that trope of culture really shows is that the arguments that are being made by alt-right groups, which are really centered in resisting anti-racist initiatives, are very much ones that are echoed, produced, reproduced in Canadian newspapers and Canadian universities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dua. We now have about a half hour for questions. And so before I turn to the many questions raised by the audience, I actually wanted to ask a question which I think each of you point to individually and collectively when we think about race and settler colonialism, but also the ways in which they play out in the academy. And so when we think about colonialism, what you're suggesting is that we need to go beyond thinking of territories, which we now gesture towards with our land acknowledgements, or the subjugation of peoples, the extinction of the native, as Patrick Wolf talks about, or cultural genocide, as the TRC puts it. But we also have to think about the role that universities played in this project of, say, empire and colonialism, including the ways in which it privileged certain bodies of knowledges, language, and so on, but also the disciplines. Our disciplines are related to this expansion, and they provide the rationale, for example, for racism or segregation or eugenics or sterilization, or even the logics of racism that white supremacists are using, as Dr. Joe just said. So this leads then to the question, and I think that was raised also by Dr. Tabani's comments, which is that diversity, including initiatives around Blackness or indigeneity alone won't solve this problem of the coloniality of the institution, that we actually need much more to think about the structure of the institution, the very formation of the institution, which was designed without women or visible or racialized minorities or indigenous peoples in mind. The disciplines were designed with others in mind. So that brings the question then is, how do we decolonize this institution in ways then that can make sense, not just of bodies, but also different bodies of knowledges that you all speak to? Who wants to start? Who wants to start? Dr. Tabani, your mic is on. And then Dr. Dewey, your mic is on after that.
Okay. Okay. So you expect an answer, I assume. Okay. So of course that is the really big question, right? And what I can say is that the chapters in the book show how all of the authors, faculty and students, because we have student voices in the book as well, the kinds of practices, everyday practices that we're engaged in within classrooms, committee meetings, the work that we do in our communities, that really tries to build on a kind of, an anti-racist, anti-colonial worldview. So this is an ongoing battle within the university. And I think that, there are many, many ways at which we can come to this question. One is, of course, the importance of knowledge production. And Canadian universities are notoriously hostile to critical race studies. Critical race studies as a place that can bring us together across these racial divides. The university is becoming more and more comfortable with siloing off different communities of color. And so the kind of the possibility of even building a collective project that could lead to decolonization is actively being countered by the, the very old and very familiar divide and rule strategies. So, what I want to really say is, although I don't have an answer, how do we colonize the institution? What I want to say is that many, many of us have been involved in this for a long time at different levels: curriculum development, scholarship, research, building ties with our communities, making sure that as we come into the university, we're opening the doors and making this knowledge available, accessible to our communities, right? Building student mentoring groups. Students of color and Indigenous students, for example, at UBC, came together to organize a research network to try and address exactly these kinds of questions. Instead of supporting these initiatives, what we saw is a real taking away, destruction of the space, really, that the students themselves had constructed. So what I want to say really is that these are ongoing contestations that are taking place every day in the university. And of course, how we build to, there are moments of breakthrough. And I think we're on the verge of a moment of breakthrough right now, given what is happening globally, given the kind of very stark challenges that we're facing at a global level in terms of the interconnectedness of the crises that I mentioned earlier, that this is a moment when a breakthrough might be possible, and the institution recognizes that, which is why this kind of expanded offer of inclusion. And so I think that reading our book will give the audience a sense of the kinds of struggles that we're involved in. And really, decolonization is a huge project. It needs to take place at multiple levels: epistemologies, administrative practices, relationships, how students are treated. All of these are implicated in this project of decolonization. What we want to do in our book is to draw attention to how these struggles are ongoing within the university and universities across Canada and the US.
Thank you. So Dr. Delia Douglas and Dr. Dua, you both have your mics off. So go ahead.
Okay, so Melinda, thank you as always for asking profound questions that get me thinking far more deeply than I want to. But they are really important questions about, how to decolonize. And it's particularly a critical question at this moment for Canadian history. So I'm going to answer in two different ways: what my paper in my chapter for Professor Thabani's collection shows, but also the question itself. I think we're at a crossroads because the TRC really challenged Canadian universities to think about decolonization. And yet what has happened within universities, as we show in the equity myth, is often too performative or non-performative. And really thinking about how we take on decolonization isn't something that we've had in-depth conversations. I know at York and other universities, there was an initial rush to hire a handful of Indigenous scholars, which itself, given the underrepresentation of Indigenous scholars in Canadian universities, is insulting. Rather than looking at systemically how we're going to how, we're going to change our hiring practices. The expectation is that these Indigenous scholars will offer courses on decolonization, and the rest of the curriculum remains intact without all of us engaging on how we think about decolonizing the university. And there are other ways that may be more controversial for me to say, but I find the land acknowledgements are really curious in what they do, and how what they do is not what was intended for them to do. And Indigenous scholars have raised this and pushed us on thinking about the land acknowledgements. So the project of decolonization in universities is really something that hasn't really lived up to the call that was made for Canadian universities. How we do that, really, I think I've suggested is like we really have to think about how we, and what Professor Thabani, and you've suggested how we teach, how we create knowledge production, but centering Indigenous knowledge and scholars within that. Not, hiring a handful and having them at the margins. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. What my chapter shows is something different. And what it shows is, resonates with what Professor Thabani said, is that knowledge production in the university is seen as crucial by conservatives and the alt-right. The circulation of phrases really tells us the way in which the alt-right is in tune to what is being said. And part of what my paper shows is the reason they're attuned is that they see and are invested in this, this project of preventing anti-racism to take place. And so that's why we get so many of alt-right talks on Canadian universities. They're invested in preventing this knowledge production, preventing critical race studies from taking place, preventing Indigenous studies to have a profound impact on our universities. And I don't want to just put it as the alt-right. I think what Professor Thabani says is really important, is that their politics are resonated within the university itself. So it's not just, the alt-right and then liberals are different or progressive are different. The resistance to transforming universities and the resistance to the knowledge that, we create as an alternative is one that is across Canada. But what that also tells me is the power of our words, the power of our scholarship. That, in doing that, I'm going to use a more optimist metaphor, whittling away, but we could go to Sarah Ahmed's metaphor of hitting the brick wall. But, there is a power to the work that we do. And, we need to continue that.
Delia, do you want to respond, or do you want me to go to another question?
Why don't you go to another question? I could readily, easily say what they said.
Okay, thanks. So there are many questions, and I think some of them, obviously, as no surprise, there's a group of them around the question of the paradox of what the data suggests, which is that most Canadian universities are populated primarily by white administrators, faculty, staff. At the same time, those same faculty staff are in charge of ushering a new era of racial equity, indigenization, and the part and then the ways in which that implicates or makes complicit BIPOC scholars, who consciously or not become part of the diversity of institutions. And so the question is, how do we grapple with this kind of these paradoxes in the academy? in a way that leads to systemic change rather than the performative gestures that you're talking about? Another big question. We can go with Dr. Douglas to start this time since she.
Thanks for that. Actually, I want to try to connect what you just asked, referred to, I guess I'm thinking about silos, and I'm thinking about the role that capitalism plays in the sense of how people have, interpreted that there's one pie and people are seeking to have a piece of the pie, and what that does to people in terms of how you interact, what kinds of loyalties, what kinds of relationships you have, and the fact that these are often corrupt. I think to the spirit of decolonization, I would say that it involves a serious reckoning with the language of EDI. Employment equity, I know, was, it didn't move the needle, and I know it was a federal policy, but what's replaced it, I would argue, has taken us back, back somewhere, I don't know. And so that language and how it's been institutionalized and formalized means that it means whatever anybody wants it to mean. And so what if we, introduce the language of racism, anti-racism, speak about white supremacy and speak about power very explicitly as one way to begin to unpack, to begin to respond to the question of decolonization. I agree that we, with Dr. Tabani's remarks about how we're doing this work in many different ways and many different locations. And I think that this is a moment of possibility, but I think it's also revealing something else we don't talk about, which are the wounds that are the result of centuries, literally, but also what silos are spaces of safety, as well as spaces, frankly, of enacting lateral violence as well. And so the extent to which people are courageous in terms of getting real with themselves and with each other and those who are not like them, and recognizing that reaching out does not minimize you, and that doesn't signal a loss, right? And I'm thinking very explicitly about, recently with the murder of George Floyd and how anti-Blackness became more visible. And while that has opened up a door, I'd say it's opened it a crack rather than, it hasn't thrown it open. But I also see resistance and resentment in this moment that I think we also haven't had legit conversations about. And so it's become a moment of possibility, also a moment of tension, hostility, and potential closure. And I think that's tied to many things, which are the legacies of the, historical and present violences and fears and anxieties around, for example, returning to the pie image, which is there's only so much here, and people understand that to be the case rather than thinking, let's reconfigure how we imagine what's possible and who we are and who we might be. Rather, many of us are stuck in a spot of closure and limit rather than thinking more expansively and more holistically and with more humility and integrity. That's what I got right now.
Thank you. Dr. Ross, your mic is, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you, everyone. When I'm listening to everyone talk, and one thing that comes to my mind is that colonization or neoliberalism only sees one type of value for every living thing, and that value is monetary. That's it. And we lose all the other important values that I know Indigenous systems understand. So Indigenous science of place or logic of place or poetry of place will talk to us through heritage language about the power relationships between all living beings, the bear and the tree, the salmon and the ant. It talks about our relationships as human beings throughout the ages and in contemporary times. It talks about our belonging with, as a community, with other living beings to a particular place that we are living in now. The personalities, not just of the humans, but of all the beings, personalities, their needs, their wants. What does the yellow cedar need? Why is it on the red list in British Columbia? What is it not getting what it needs? What's its personality? What does it want to do with its life? You know, and it's a question I have also for my students. What's your personality? You know, you're valuable, and just telling people they're valuable because they really are. And it seems something we all need to hear. Where's the American bittern in this story of Mount Currie in relationship to the salmon and the bears? And if we start talking about the true intrinsic value of every living thing as our foundational understanding for where we are and what we're doing, I think that would just make a tremendous change, and it would go forward into the human sphere about talking about the value of human beings in our diversities, all of our diversities. Because that's really what we're saying, and we're opening up this conversation that I feel capitalism and colonialism has shut off. It's shut off our relationship with each other and with every other living thing. So the only value for our popular culture is the superficial, preposterous, meaningless stuff, you know. And I just think if we really had to learn or wanted to learn who these beings are alongside us and why each and every one of us is so terribly important to the whole and has such great value in so many ways, it has nothing to do with the monetary. I think that would be a huge step towards decolonization.
Dr. Tabani.
Yes, I would like to say something actually. It's what Dr. Dua said is true. Asking the kind of unanswerable question makes you think deeper about these issues. So I want to build on what everybody said so far. And I think the point that I'd like to make is that decolonization is an ongoing process. It's a global process. It's a historical process. You know, we are focused on settler colonialism here, but colonialism is a global structure. And, you know, when we look at, for example, neoliberalism doesn't come out of anywhere. Neoliberalism comes out of the whole Third World Project, the national liberation movements. However much they were flawed, it was the little bits that they were able to achieve, right? That neoliberalism emerges in response to. And so I think that when we think about decolonization, is we have to have this longer kind of understanding of it, a longer and a deeper understanding of colonialism and of what is called the coloniality of power, right? That, you know, in a way, we really are blimps in this long process, right? And so I think that's really important for us to understand. The other thing that I think we often tend to not pay attention to is what our movements actually accomplish. So for example, you know, let's look at the war on terror and the kind of emergence of these white supremacist movements. It's really the failures of the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It's the failures of those projects that have unleashed the kind of white supremacist response and its movement into mainstream politics. And it really was the resistance, right? Anti-war resistance, the resistance to the Islamophobia construct of Muslims as terrorists, the anti-racist kind of coalitions that we were able to build. And so I think we do have to acknowledge, like, what are the changes that our movements are able to make. And I think that what Black Lives Matters has done at the moment, what Indigenous resurgence has done, is it has shifted these discourses and these struggles to a different level. And we need to recognize that these are kind of tied to the struggles of these movements. And I think within the university is kind of one place where this struggle for decolonization takes place, a very important site. And, I think that for me, it's been really important to stick with this project of building critical race studies within the university as a place which creates an opportunity for us to come together, to bring together all of the scholarship, all of the histories that we bring with us.
Mhm. Okay.
And try and think through collectively. For me, this is the most crucial thing for us to understand is, yes, we are asymmetrically positioned within this hierarchy of race. But in a way, we need to come together to transform it, recognizing, not denying these asymmetries of power. And we've really struggled to build race, for example, as a space, a network, an association that allows us to do this. So I think those two things is to recognize that decolonization is a much longer historical process. That process is unfolding differently in different parts of the world, and that we have achieved through our struggles of the last 20, 30 years, something quite significant, right? The Indigenous resurgence, for example, has changed the whole national discourse in Canada. Yeah. And we're seeing that, the fight against Islamophobia has also done that. Black Lives Matter now is also transforming the discourse around anti-Black racism, right? And challenging it. Where this will all take us really depends on what we do with this moment.
I want to link up a few questions that are in the Q&A. One is, there is this, despite all of these discussions we're having around strategies for hiring more Black scholars, including cluster hires or Indigenous scholars, there is still the reality that many Black racial, BIPOC scholars are themselves still in spaces where they're one, and they are feeling not pushed out. So retention remains an issue because of the climate or the environment in which people work. A second kind of question, though, is what is necessary to create an environment or space where BIPOC aren't presumed incompetent? So the construction of BIPOC, the assumption that if you hire, say, more equitably, you're hiring less excellence. And you're hiring less, the lack of excellence is located in the bodies and the bodies of knowledge of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So what would be an alternative to this? What is necessary to dismantle this deficit thinking that frames and enables and buttresses the current structures of hiring and retention within institutions? Another unanswerable question. Go ahead, Ina.
Thank you, Melinda. And I'm enjoying this conversation with all of you because it's so thought-provoking. And my conversations with all of you have always helped me deepen my understanding. So Melinda, your question on what we can do at this moment to make the university a place that's not of violence against BIPOC faculty, I think is a really important one, and one that I've thought about, and at York we've worked on. And I don't think it's easy. I'm getting distracted by what I want to say with the instance that took place today or yesterday in a department. I'm also the chair of the Race Equity Caucus at York University. And there was an instance of a Black faculty who was teaching anti-racism in a course that got, who had whitelash from some of the students in the course. The students started a WhatsApp group, had a WhatsApp group, and started to undermine the faculty and her competence to be teaching. Now, I share that instance because it's not just our colleagues, it's our students, it's administration. It's so insidious. And I know, Delia, you talk about this in your research. It's so insidious that how do we do that? I'm not quite sure. One of my colleagues who, talks about the importance of shifting university culture. Now, whenever you say culture after the paper I get uncomfortable. I don't, I think that's making it too easy. How do you shift culture? We've been talking about it for hundreds of years. And it's, what you've challenged us to think about before, Melinda, that, decolonizing, and what Sunira says, decolonizing is a long history that we're oblivion. So how do we do that? I always come back to, and this is some of my research, I always come back to, because I struggle on this, is saying we've just got to make sure that we have policies and procedures in place to protect people. And I know that's really a liberal response. And I, have a dialogue with a colleague about York every day as we're strategizing on what to do. But I go back to, if we can offer some protection and way of addressing it that's institutional, it's immediate. It's partial, but there's something. The larger project, to me, I get, just after this last couple of weeks of what's been happening at York, it's hard. Like, what do I say to this faculty when she has been undermined by students in her class, and those in institutional power are listening to the students and not her? How do we change that? I don't know.
Well, this conversation, I could go on with all of you for another hour. Unfortunately, we are at time. Dr. Ross, did you want to offer a comment before I close out? I saw your mic was off.
Thank you. I'll be brief. And this is something that I've talked to colleagues and friends in and out of communities my whole decades of teaching, the undermining, the expectation of my own incompetence. And I try to remind people, most of us can't just be trained, we have to be hyper trained. We have to have more than the basics, and we have to do more than the basics just to be maligned. This incident you mentioned, Ina, I had a similar thing at the beginning of the semester. So I think I've come to an understanding in that I have what I need to teach, and it's important, and there's a curriculum, and the curriculum is sacred, and it moves forward justice and rights, and it moves forward many of the topics that we're talking about here. And if something is a personal attack against me, it's not in the curriculum. So you can stay in the class or you can do whatever. I mean, I've personally been bullied on Facebook and other places. And you got to get to a point, I'm sorry to say it, there's going to be people who won't share that pie that Delia is talking about, even though there's enough pie for everybody. There's room for everybody. There's room for all of our values. We got to just do the work and focus on the work and take solace where we can and keep the allies close, because it is not an easy job, and it is not for the faint of heart, as we all, I know. And this is the work of disruption. This is the work of actualizing justice in our own way as teachers and community members and women and human beings. I wish us all the very best. Courage.
Well, I think that's an important note to end this courageous conversation on. And I want to really express my profound thanks to each of you for Dr. Tabani, Dr. Douglas, Dr. Ross, Dr. Dua, for participating in this conversation. And I would like to say that the video, the webinar will be available on our website and will be shared by people who registered for the event. It will go out. I also want to encourage people who are subscribers to Courageous Conversations that Dr. Verna St-Denis will be speaking on February 3rd. Again, it's on our website. On February 11th, there's a session on anti-racism in the university. February 24th, Untold Stories, Thoughts on Black Students. And then on March 22nd, we'll have Dr. Sarah Ahmed speaking about her new book on complaints. Again, these will go out in the webinar for those of you who registered. So from me, my profound appreciation, wonderful to see you all, and thank you, and hope to see you at the next Courageous Conversation Speaker Series. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.